This is Abigail Shrier, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
This is interesting. Now, hopefully, Will Riley's going to join us. He is the official producer of this episode. He connected us all. But I guess I'll let you introduce yourself as far as who you are to everybody. You're a bit of a controversial figure, and I read your book, and I think it's wonderful. And I think you're doing, just from all of us in humanity and parenthood, goodness gracious, thank you for doing this and tackling this, dangerous. I mean, it's a dangerous topic to talk about this because there's a lot of ideological craze, but there's also a lot of life and death consequences. And so it's not an easy choice to make. So I appreciate you taking that fight on.
Oh, thanks. I've said this before, but this is not a topic I went looking for. A reader wrote to me, and she told me that her daughter had gotten caught up in this. Her daughter had no history of gender dysphoria as a child, but all of a sudden, had a lot of mental health issues as a young adult and a lot of mental health struggles, and decided with her friends when she went off to college at 18 that she was trans and started testosterone. And I knew this was happening across the country, and no one wanted to report on it. So I tried to find an investigative journalist to do this, and no one would take it on. So eventually I did.
How has it been? I mean, I know you've been on a lot of different shows talking about the work and everything, and I want to get into that. But the response, I mean, obviously you're going to have some blowback. I've seen it online from doing prep. But how has it been for you personally and professionally?
It's been interesting. We're living in such a weird time, and everything seems to be taboo, and the left decides what's taboo, and the left enforces it, and our institutions have been taken over. So, by this wokeism. So, the New York Times is no longer the New York Times and whatnot, and the universities are no longer, are enforcing all this. And my book's just one more and an endless series of taboos that really shouldn't be. But it is. This is a mental health issue facing teenage girls. That's all. It has nothing to do with other transgender people, transgender adults. It does not just purport to describe everyone's experience. It simply says that we have a sharp and startling uptick in teenage girls, a population that's never had gender dysphoria before in the 100-year diagnostic history. Suddenly teenage girls are claiming to have gender dysphoria, and they're convincing themselves, they're convincing their friends, they're demanding hormones and surgeries, and they're getting them. And that's just something worth looking into because this population does not seem to have real gender dysphoria. So it's worth looking into what's going on and why. And instead, a bunch of activists have said, no, that topic's off limits.
Yeah, and it's tough. So let me just do the caveats so we can get past all that stuff.
Sure.
You're not a trans denier. I'm not a trans denier. One of my very dearest and oldest friends has a trans kid. Doesn't matter who that person is. But, we've talked about this, and it's hard for this person to have this conversation because they're 100% behind their kid, as they should be. So this isn't a bunch of people denying science or trying to make people's lives harder. And from what I read in the book, you're not proposing that people, take their kids to church and Jesus the trans out of them. You're not saying that at all. So before we get to any of that stuff, and then also just as a means of, I say my co-founder says bona fides. I say bona fides, and you say it differently, I think, or at least in the book it said differently. The bona fides for the article that you reference is often challenged. But as someone that's peer reviewed, and Dr. Riley's with us now. Hey, Will, he's also peer reviewed. There's norms with this process, and from what you describe in the book, from your main academic source, and then your other doctors that come on, the attacks, the questioning of the academia. Like if something's been peer reviewed, it's been peer reviewed. They're supposed to catch any kind of methodological problems or anything. So can you talk a little bit about? Actually, let me go back to Will. Will, what are your thoughts on if something's published peer reviewed and there's a problem methodologically? Are the peers supposed to catch that? How often is something pulled back from release and said, hey, by the way, because of ideological disagreement, or is that in any way a normal circumstance?
Well, first, good to see you, Pete. Good to see you, Abigail.
Good to see you.
Hi.
Our building's locked down because of coronavirus. So I had to go out to my truck and get a pass card to come in as a teacher, as one of the executives. So sorry to be a bit late. In terms of peer review, first of all, I will say every scientific article is flawed to some extent. I mean, I think of myself as a good methodologist, but what I do is fairly simple. It's linear, log linear, logistic, so on regression. That's the technique. So someone could use a more advanced method or even a simpler method, like just looking at raw numbers, and either one of those could bring them to different conclusions than me. That doesn't mean I'm wrong. It just means the article is somewhat limited. What peer review is supposed to do is say, this is a quality enough piece to get into a top 100 or whatever the case might be journal. And it's very, very rare that a piece gets through peer review by, say, 3 people. That's a complete piece of garbage, at least in the quantitative sciences, like anything that we're talking about here. I will say that over in the humanities, that can happen. So, I mean, you had James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose write papers about whether, is the doggy position feminist for animals and so on, and nonsense like this. One was just a chapter of Mein Kampf.
Yeah.
And those were accepted to a lot of these kind of very left-wing postmodern journals. But in the field that we're talking about with anything you guys would have submitted or that would be in the book, yeah, peer review is pretty valid. Last point on this, when things are pulled in peer review, it's very often political. Like if something gets through peer review, it's been out there for a couple of years, and then the author says, whoops, I messed up on table C. We better pull that back. That's very, very often because there's a backlash from the left or the Christian right or something like that. The best paper that I read recently about police shootings from the Michigan State team, I believe, they just withdrew that to revise or something. But the reason for that is that people were complaining about it because they found white people were as likely to get shot by cops as black people. I'm not going to call out those guys, but that's why they're going through these extensive revisions, which will, I strongly suspect, find the same thing. And similarly, trans activists are very known for jumping on pieces and saying, this technical fact is off. You could do that with almost any piece. That's a political action.
Right. Well, in the case of...
I'm going to let you talk in a second, Abigail. I promise.
Sure.
The other thing I wanted to say, you're going to get to talk most of the show. I'm going to shut up. But the other thing is one of the pieces of criticism I saw talked about the status of the professor being an assistant professor, which somehow was supposed to devalidate what they said. This person has a PhD. They've got a license to do their work they're doing, and they're on a journey towards whatever, tenure or a full research staff. So when people say that, just for the audience, being an assistant professor means that you've got a PhD and you've earned your right to hold a position of authority in a given topic. Okay, sorry, Abigail, please continue.
Sorry. So the research we're talking about is Lisa Littman's work. Lisa Littman is not only a medical doctor, but also a public health researcher. And at the time she wrote this, she was at Brown University. And there is actually no real question about her either credentials or the integrity of her research. In fact, when the activists forced the paper to be pulled and it to be revisited, she did a revision and came out with the exact same results. So there really is no question about the actual integrity of her work. She looked into why there was a sudden explosion in teenage girls deciding they were transgender in America. And she hypothesized that social contagion was the reason for it. And, that's a perfectly valid hypothesis to test. What, of course, the activists want is no one talking about this at all, and they get to decide which topics are completely off limits. That whole new thing where we go by a tiny group of activists' hurt feelings and let that be our guide for inquiry is really a bizarre and unfortunate feature of our age.
When you say an explosion, characterize what that means.
Sure.
The president was saying trees explode the other day and people lost their minds. What is an explosion?
Yeah, sure. So in this phenomenon is across the West because social media is across the West, and all these teenage girls they learn about this phenomenon often from their schools or through social media, but social media plays a big role. And in England, we saw they actually have centralized healthcare, so they are able to track the numbers most easily, and they have seen a 4,400% rise in young adolescent girls presenting at gender clinics asking for hormones and surgeries and whatnot. That's enormous. We know that it's also enormous in the United States because between the years of 2016 and 2017, we saw the number of gender surgeries quadruple on biological females. And we know that today, out of nowhere, gender dysphoria, which used to afflict 0.01% of the population, so 1 in 10,000 people, most of them males, is now we have 2% of high school students in America, hundreds of thousands of young American high school students saying they're transgender. We know that that number is rising, and we know that it's overwhelmingly female.
What does that say to your quant brain, Will?
Well, I mean, I think that I actually agree with the conclusions of this quote unquote extremely controversial paper. And I would say that outside of that narrow sphere of kind of sexology, maybe would be the correct term, probably most people do. I think kids are trend followers. You've seen this across the years with all kinds of, using the word in its layman sense, crazy things, cutting, bulimia. I mean, I was a student in an athlete for Aurora East when the heroin epidemic really was taking off in high school. And our bluntly white cross-city rival, Naperville North, I mean, there were literally people on smack. People were going through the school with drug dogs and so on. It was the wildest thing in the world. My buddies there were making comments like, we want to go to the black school where it's safe. And that went on for a couple of years, this heavy drug use, the end of the rave scene, and then it just sort of petered out. And that was a real problem. I mean, there were deaths in the community of people that I knew. So I think that this, and I'm not comparing this to being addicted to heroin or something like this, but the idea that this idea of being gender queer, queer positive, sex positive, all of this edgy sex related stuff is being presented to kids. And there are forums like Scarlet Teen, if you know any teens that really do this all the time, Teen Vogue. And kids are responding to it and they're saying, well, maybe this is me. That sounds very plausible to me. I don't have any hate for these kids, but I do think it's important that adults take a look at this and ask questions like, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to be on the show. I mean, ask questions like, do these people really have gender dysphoria, which is an actual medically recognized condition? It obviously was well before the sort of PCization of psychology. That needs to be treated by adults, however they and their medical professional best feel they can treat it. But do these kids really have GD in any classic sense? I mean, how long are these people trans on average? The one figure I've been ever able to read in a preprint was 3 months. So, I mean, I'd be really interested in unpacking some of this stuff. And I have a lot of questions. Most of my questions are probably technical as a wonk. But I mean, to what extent do you need a doctor's approval plus a psychologist's approval to do this stuff? I mean, can you get testosterone without that? Can you get binders? Can you get the top surgery? I mean, so I tend to agree with the piece that a lot of trends take off in middle school and high school, especially among women in those close-knit groups that are extremely harmful. When we actually looked at what happened in Aurora and Naperville, it was surprisingly girls that first started doing a lot of the hard drugs. The whole thing was pretty amazing when they started unpacking it, and you can't help noticing similarities among these trends.
That's right. If we were allowed to talk about this, if the activists weren't deciding what everyone could talk about, this would in some sense be another humdrum fad to hit teens, another dangerous humdrum fad to hit and spread among teenage girls. The big problem and the big difference when you talked about sort of the epidemics of heroin and whatnot is that no teachers were valorizing young heroin addicts. No therapists were agreeing that heroin life is the life for you. But that is what you're seeing. You don't need a therapist. No, we now have an informed consent model, which means that a patient at whatever age, and the age of medical consent varies by state, a person presents themselves, they say they have gender dysphoria. Often this is a teenage girl, and they sign a waiver and they walk out with testosterone that day. And there are even surgeons who are willing to perform double mastectomies without even a therapist note. So young teenage girls are self-diagnosing and they're walking out with irreversible, hormones and surgeries.
Okay.
There are young kids. I mean, kids are so impressionable. You can see the impact. You can see literally walking around every day, the impact that the Kardashian corporation has had on girls. They wear the same kind of pants. They all have the Kardashian makeup and hair, because girls want to, just like all, but we're talking about girls specifically in this thing. I mean, that's how simple this is. Like, if it becomes a fad, a lot of things change about how they talk, about how they walk. This seems like this falls into this. And with this explosion, as you called it, being a parent is hard. And when your kid is harming themselves, or in some kind of form of mental crisis, it's tough. But you know, people that mutilate their bodies, there's people that literally cut their penises in half long ways. Who knows why, but that's what they need to do. But you wouldn't send your kid to a doctor and say, what they need to mutilate their bodies. This is what, as a psychologist, you would never say, allow that. You would work on the psychosis part of this. Like, why does this person have this need? And as an adult, God bless, go do what you're doing. But we're talking 13-year-old girls here who want to take dramatic, life-changing steps.
Yeah, the difference is that we have medical associations all participating in what they call affirmative care, meaning agreeing with the patient's self-diagnosis, even when that patient is a very troubled, teenage girl. Now, these girls have very high rates of other mental health problems. There's a lot of comorbidity, anxiety, depression, so there are a lot of other untreated comorbidities at play, and instead the doctor, who should be a critical examiner of what's really going on and using their own judgment, their own professional judgment, not the teenagers, is instead just agreeing and rubber stamping whatever the young teenager says. And as I said, the age of medical consent varies by state. In Oregon, it's 15. You don't need parental permission for this. And the doctor will exercise no restraint.
Terrifying.
One thing that to kind of jump in here quickly, one thing that I want to do is almost clarify that a little bit. So is there anything state by state that you need to do to say that you have gender dysphoria? I.e., if you're a young girl, and I mean, I'm going on 40, so these would all be young kids to me, but if you're 15 and you go into a medical professional's office and you say, I have gender dysphoria, is there anything that's required for you to demonstrate that? I mean, a certain amount of time, quote unquote, living as the opposite sex, or a note from a psychiatrist, or is that just the doctor or the shrink, quote unquote, can say, well, obviously you do?
Right. No, is the answer. Nothing is required. So you go in and you're effectively self-diagnosing, and affirmative care says that their really role is to agree with you. Okay. They take on your pronouns and they agree with your diagnosis. And there is no proof. Now, some surgeons, there are surgeons who will ask for a therapist note, probably just to shield themselves from liability. Many surgeons do not ask for a therapist note, and entirely based on a young woman's, insistence, they will remove healthy breasts where there is no medical indication of a problem.
And what percentage of girls outgrow any sort of body dysmorphia?
So in prior eras, well, first of all, this was always overwhelmingly male. Part of the reason that we know that this isn't traditional gender dysphoria, it was always overwhelmingly male. Okay. And it began in early childhood, ages 2 to 4. So now we're seeing all of a sudden teenage girls with no childhood history. So what percentage typically outgrew it? There have been many surveys on this, and the studies differ, but always the overwhelming majority of kids outgrew this. Some studies say 70%, other studies say over 80%, but most kids typically outgrew it. Today, we're going to end up with different numbers. And the reason is because today you have not only parents, but teachers, therapists, doctors celebrating the child's new identity and agreeing with it. When this was left alone, kids would outgrow it. Today, with this new kind of attitudes toward gender dysphoria, and then this phenomenon of teenage girls, which is a copycat phenomenon, not traditional gender dysphoria, we're going to end up with a lot of different numbers. But we are already seeing a lot of regret. These so-called detransitioners who go through medical treatments and regret them. There are really high rates among this population of young women.
Wow.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, sorry, Pete. No, I think the thing that's surprising to me, and also to Pete, when he's just sort of saying, yeah, okay. I mean, the thing that's remarkable about this is the sort of, when you use the term affirmative care, kind of the lack of, at least from the description here, medical oversight. I guess the second part of my question would be, so what can you do at the level of affirmative care or affirmative treatment? I mean, I would assume there has to be some limit. Like, you can't get what I've heard called bottom surgery. Can you get testosterone prescribed to you? Can you get the top, you mentioned mastectomies are possible. What can you do while the doctor is simply affirming you or agreeing with your self-diagnosis in general, in your opinion, a typical state?
Well, most girls start testosterone. They don't even need a doctor's approval. They go into Planned Parenthood at 18. They can sign a form and walk out with testosterone that day. Sometimes they've only seen a physician's assistant. They don't, at various clinics, they've only seen a physician's assistant. They sign a form. And so there really isn't medical oversight for a lot of this stuff. Remember that doctors today are afraid to speak up about this. So most doctors who think, wait a second, this is not a good idea. I don't know what this young woman's actual presentation is, but it doesn't seem to be what she says, but I have to follow affirmative care. What they do is they refer out. So the best doctors, the ones who are skeptical of this, will refer to someone who is not at all skeptical. And, you can decide for yourself, whether it's a good idea to go to a doctor who's completely unskeptical about a patient's self-diagnosis.
Are there patterns in both directions? Like, we know drug-seeking behavior for doctors. They use that to protect themselves and the patient from getting, opiates or whatever. But then is there also a pattern of like, this really is what gender dysmorphia really looks like, and then our kids learning to ape that and say, oh yes, of course, I've always wanted to whatever, and then make it. So the two-sided question, but are the doctors able to actually check for this, and are the kids coached, that kind of thing?
So there is active coaching online. The influencers, the transgender influencers, play a massive role, and Lisa Littman's research showed this. And you just look at the numbers of views. These people have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. You're talking about millions of kids seeing this stuff, and they're being, coached and encouraged in the symptoms they're supposed to present with. But is there anything verifiable? Actually, there isn't. I mean, by a doctor. The kids will insist that they always felt this way. They always knew they were different. I mean, it's typical of any hysteria. They present with vague symptoms. I always knew I was different. I always had this sense that this body wasn't right for me. This is a very vague set of so-called symptoms. But we do know what actual gender dysphoria looks like, and it begins in early childhood, and it's severe and consistent. It's not an ephemeral feeling. It's not something that passes quickly. It's a real, the reason we've, allowed transition is because it really is a constant chafing that began in early childhood for some individuals. It's not something you learn on YouTube with your friends. It's not something you come out together because it gains you popularity. So we know what these girls are aping really doesn't look like traditional gender dysphoria at all.
I'm just shocked by all this. How in the world did we get to this point? I mean, how are doctors who take an oath, how are they being driven by and what the hell is a trans influencer? What the heck is going on here? Why are doctors so far behind on this? I thought we believed in science around here,
Well, we don't. I mean, let's be honest. What's in the background? I mean, I would say social media, right? It's the same thing that intimidates every other institution, every other accrediting organization. It intimidates good people. It tells them there will be a high price to pay if they use their own judgment and apply their own skepticism. And there are major costs. I mean, when doctors, first, when I started out writing about this, doctors were contacting me, and it sounded like they lived in the Soviet Union. They would tell me they cannot give their medical judgment about this on an area that is their expertise without fear of being fired. It didn't remind me at all of what it meant to be a doctor in America in previous decades. But we have this incredible weapon, which is social media, in which you can expose each other. You can expose anyone for failing to comply. And, the repercussions are really severe, and they're really frightening.
Well,
yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot there. Like, I mean, I'm a controversial sort of center-right writer, and I get a bunch of crazy crap on social media from both the left and the alt-right. And for me, it doesn't really bother me. I mean, I was an internet kid. I was an early adopter of computer tech in 94, 95, something like that. I came from a big city. So, I mean, people talk less trash on the internet now than they did in the earlier Wild West days by quite a lot. But I mean, definitely when you think about a distinguished physician aged 55, I mean, you have something like an OBGYN practice. I mean, no, you don't want to have your scholarly papers criticized by these people who you probably view as wingnuts. I mean, you may never have had that experience of being mobbed on Twitter. I mean, I have about the standard 20,000 or so Twitter followers. But if I had 100 and all of a sudden thousands of people were coming from nowhere saying that I was transphobic and posting edited pictures of me online and so on, I would feel like I was being attacked by a mob. I mean, I have no doubt that plays a role. I mean, again, my comments on this were just sort of practical. I mean, I find it interesting and surprising that you can essentially just say you have this significant psychological condition, and assuming you're over 17 or 18, the basic things, perhaps top surgery, definitely testosterone, that are involved in that can be given to you. I mean, certainly some doctors won't do it, but it doesn't sound like this would be very hard to do. Testosterone, by the way, is a very potent, essentially, drug. Yeah. I mean, that's what almost all steroids are. They're just pure testosterone. I took a testosterone booster, Testocin, for about a half year, and I quit because it actually worked, and I was getting more aggressive and stupider. So, I mean, there's a very significant impact of quadrupling your free testosterone levels. I mean, you'd see athletic performances soar through the roof. You'd see level of aggression soar through the roof. I mean, many intimate relationships as a woman might end. You'd have different preferences. You'd be far more aggressive. So I'm surprised to hear that. And yeah, I'm sure Abigail's correct. The reason for that is nervousness on the part of doctors. Another question that I have about this is, what do you, as something of an expert in this field, think is going on with these kids? I mean, if it weren't for the trend toward a trans diagnosis, would these be people that perhaps in a couple of years would turn out to be gay or bisexual? I mean, you assume that something is going on there, but if they had not decided they were trans for what we looked at was an average of X number of months or years, but with these potentially serious effects, what would they be? Would they go on to a quote unquote normal adult life, or would they become gay women? What do you think would happen?
Some of them would be gay women. The thing to note is that these are profoundly lonely young people. They are so lonely. Their rates of anxiety and depression are so high. We've never seen rates like this among young women. And they're living lives online rather than living lives with each other. They are so alienated from each other and from their bodies, from a natural organic attraction or identity. Some of these girls are deciding that they are pansexual or bisexual, whatever they are, at ages 11 and 12, having never had a kiss. And frankly, they're not confiding this in each other because they don't have the same kind of best friend relationships. They're going online where really an army of disturbing adults wait to advise them. It's a scary world out there for young women. And I'll just say one last thing you talked about. You talked about, Will, how you wouldn't, necessarily be intimidated by the online crazies and all the nasty comments you get online. And I would say there's something really different about you, and I think about me as well. And that is, when you're a conservative and you've been in elite institutions your whole life, you're so used to not having the favor of, the respected, academe or the elites. This is something that is so natural to you that speaking the truth is just, or giving your views is just what you've been doing your whole life, with or without their favor. But a lot of the parents I talk to are political progressives, and they were completely caught off guard that the institutions they so admired, like Planned Parenthood, would turn around and call them transphobes. They weren't ready for that. So I think it's been especially hard on political progressives for liberals to see themselves so kicked around by the culture.
I mean, the other part that shocked me, apart from, and I love that you kept saying that this is a progressive mom. She's, and she's researching all of these things, and she's positive this is not right for her kid. I mean, moms know their kids, but also the role of the school and the teachers union in the advancement of these ideas. That seems, I understand that the school's role is always kind of changing and fluid, but that seems to be overstepping to keep something secret from the parent. I mean, I'll point to me, it is the parent's primary job to get this kid from A to Z. And I don't need another element coming in and undermining my program, my responsibility.
Yeah, parents really have no idea how much they're being undermined by the school systems. Parents had no idea, even when they fight these things politically. In California, there was a major protest by parents because they got a hold of the new curriculum for SOGI that was called Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity. And they got a hold of it. And I think it was in 2018, they held a major protest in Northern California and said, we don't want this. We don't want this gender identity being taught to our 5-year-olds. And so there were certain accommodations that were made, it still became a mandatory. They played all kinds of games with the parents. They told them, well, sexual orientation you can opt out of, and parents understood that, not realizing that sexual orientation and gender identity was being put in the anti-bullying curriculum. It was not part of sexual education. So they weren't allowed to opt out of it. The other thing is, when they removed books that parents objected to from the official curriculum, they then supplied them to teachers through the online virtual libraries. So the games that are being played with parents are legion, and parents aren't aware of it for good reason. They don't realize that so many cases, the teachers are being coached by activists. The materials are being supplied by activists. The videos are being are created by activists. And what's going on in the schools is a really, really radical approach to gender.
My friend Adolfo, and I'm going to put his question back up here. He brings up a question, and then my personal friend whose child transitioned or is transitioning, they say that there are gates to get through, on the medical side, through the psychological side. But you're saying something different. Is this a case by case or state by state or county by county thing? Or, here's someone that works in the field. My friend has been through the process and he disagrees as well. How do we sort out what is reality with that?
Okay, because you're talking about something different. You're talking about a young child who needs parental, right? You need parental permission for a lot of these. So yes, before you eliminate a young child's future fertility, of course there are hoops. There aren't enough. There aren't nearly enough. But do they exist? Of course. I mean, you're talking about truly eliminating possibly the capacity ever to have orgasm or birth or, be fertile in the future. So I would hope there are restrictions. Unfortunately, there aren't enough. But I'm talking about young teenagers who hit the age of medical consent in their states. So once that happens, they've been through puberty. They're not going on puberty blockers. They're going straight to testosterone, a Schedule III controlled substance. And they're walking out the same day with it on their own recognizance.
Are there other things in the teen medical field that resemble this? Like this level of consent?
Well, birth control. Certainly in California, the argument was made in the California public school system. Wait a second, if we're giving birth control to cisgender kids at a young age on their own recognizance, if they're able to walk out of the school to get it, but without parental permissions, then certainly transgender identified kids, meaning kids who've decided, often without parents' knowledge, that they're transgender, they should be allowed to go get their hormones too. So those are the arguments that are made. And you're talking about kids who have reached age of medical consent in their state, whatever that age is.
It makes me shake my head that we're in this position. You said the word cisgender. I've heard that used as a put down for people. What is the status of that, being cis or just simply being homosexual in the zeitgeist for young adolescent girls?
So that's what's disturbing about it. I interviewed a lot of transgender adults for this, what used to be known as transsexuals. Now they're referred to as transgender adults for the book. And none of this was true of them. So in other words, there wasn't this strong in-group, out-group flavor that it's the kind of thing that leads parents to call it a cult. And they didn't punish outsiders. They didn't punish people who left that world. But today they do, and they're able to do this because of the importance of social media. And cisgender has become a very derogatory thing. I don't necessarily abide or keep up with all the sensitivities around the ever evolving lexicon of allowables and disallowables. But that's why, that word gets, there's a very us versus them flavor to a lot of this, gender world, or transgender activism, I should say.
Well,
yeah, I mean, there are quite a few questions here. I mean, they come in different orders if we're going to be going for another half hour. So I think the one that comes to mind right now actually is a little broader. But when you said that these kids are very caught up in this internet world, I see this myself with younger friends of mine and with friends my own age as kids. It's an almost entirely digital visual space. There's very little human contact, to the extent that it's crazy. sometimes. I know people that have fairly explicit OnlyFans and Tinder profiles, but that are afraid to contact other humans and ask for a date. That both male and female would be unable to say. I actually advised about this on social media and in a men's group recently, but they would be unable to say, do you want to go with me to Giuseppe's at 7 this Friday? So it's the lack of, for example, people under 30 in the USA are having less sex than at any time since the 1950s. But many of them are literally producing porn at the same time they are not having sex. It's kind of remarkable. So I guess what the question is, what leads kids into this entirely internet world? Is there a way for parents to avoid that through signing the little tykes up for softball or something? Is there a certain sort of individual that's very likely to wind up in these spaces? By the way, this is also where the alt-right is. When you get into certain debates on Twitter and you see 100 people with frog profile pictures swarming in. This is also where the few legitimate Islamic terrorists are. This is where Antifa is. When people ask, does that group exist? Just go to Facebook or Twitter and search Antifa. I mean, how do you stop kids from getting involved in all these weird worlds that are entirely online? Talking to a 19-year-old black girl in another state who's giving you sexual advice. What's the barrier to that other than just being there? Or is that it?
I mean, part of it's what you said, signing them up for Little League. The more in-person experiences you can push them to have. And remember, kids, these are hard. You know, you face rejection. You face someone who doesn't like you back. You know, adolescence has never been easy. The only reason we all went through it is because we had no alternatives. We had to be dumped. We had to tell someone we liked them, and we had to go through the experience of not being liked back or eventually being liked back. And there was no alternative. That's the only reason we ever went through it. But you're right. You know, the more you can do to get them away from this. Social media is terrible for them. It has been terrible for them. And even the young women I interview who are trans-identified, you know, they even if they're in relationships, when I ask Gen Z, and this is, you know, those born 1995 and after, when I ask them about their boyfriends and girlfriends, the number of questions they don't know about this person, they don't know the answer to this person, is astonishing. And I realize it's because they're not spending time in person. A lot of their relationships are online. They don't get to the deep and uncomfortable questions. So you ask them basic questions about their significant other, and they don't know the answers.
Yeah.
There's a real, yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, it's just their relationships are more superficial. And unfortunately, it really doesn't allow them the depth that would be very good for them.
Yeah, and that's true to a remarkable extent. I mean, I read a study recently that found that young people, first, they weren't having sex because they don't know how to ask for dates. But when they were having sex, they were having remarkably explicit sex. The percentage of women that said they've been choked, punched in the face, spit on, this kind of thing was something like 40 or 50%. But the unique thing was that neither person in a lot of these couples seemed to like this. The women often felt abused. The men felt like their partner was presenting as quote unquote a slut, like they didn't enjoy the experience. And it struck me that they just never talked about it. This was how they'd seen professional actors perform in porn movies, and they'd never just sat down and discussed their own preferences after dinner. So yeah, I think this very much is an issue. It's this isolated, I mean, so for example, something like 20 million people play Second Life, and it might be a good idea to focus on your first one instead without giving sort of glib businessy advice. This really is a problem for young folks, just like drugs were for my generation. Everyone wants that escape into another world, but at least smoking weed and going to play basketball, you still have to see people. In this case, you don't have to at all. You're the elf king in some isolated world you've made up as a gamer or a Twitter bot or a would-be porn star. So at any rate, I like your advice. Sign them up for Little League, which I mean, I also mentioned. But I think this is the key element. These sort of lonely children separated from the real research in the library, separated from real athletics and interplay, real romance that tend to fall into a lot of this stuff. That's not to say no one has gender dysphoria, but when you look at that increase, I believe, Abigail, you said it was from 0.1 or 0.05% to 3%. That definitely represents something going on in society, and it might well be this.
Right. I mean, another way to say what you're saying is that teenagers today don't seem to be having any fun. Right.
Well, they're definitely not. Yeah, I mean, they're not, you know, practicing their fist fighting skills and having sex in cars and playing dangerous sports outside. It's interesting, in fact, because they seem to be decadent but sheltered. I get the impression of people that have seen virtually everything. I mean, there was an entire genre of online video featuring people killing small animals with their feet for a while until platforms like YouTube finally removed it. So, I mean, you have people that have these Roman emperor levels of exposure to different things, but haven't actually done them in real life. Have very likely never been punched in the face or had the experience of making the team or, you know, kissed the first actual person at 11 or 12 behind the library. So, yeah, it's a weird, and I still remember all those experiences. The first person I kissed, you know, that kind of thing. Falling off.
Of course, we all do, right? I mean, those were huge. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, but I was going to add into, how about the first person you punch in the face and they get up and you're like, oh.
Oh, yeah, that's a real experience, too. The first serious fight I got into, I lost. And, like, that's not anything like, and my neighborhood is a Black and Irish American neighborhood in Chicago. Everybody could fight. Italian Americans as well. It's not like the movies where someone is hit once and they fall down and then they don't get back up. These were guys whose, like, 3 big brothers were all Marines. So when you see someone do a backflip and get back on their feet, it's like, oh man, this is going to keep going on, isn't it? So, but those are real experiences. The person doing the backflip who's going to go into the army is not in a video game. They're a real person that might hit you or stab you. And I think that there's much more distance from those sort of experiences now. And again, I'm not mocking actual trans adults here at all, but I think that's what allows for the increased fantasy of youth life today. Where you look at the list of genders, and it's not people arguing over whether you can be either of the two. It's people saying, well, there are actually 158 of them. If you look at the full list of genders, which has been on Reddit for a couple of years, that's been put together by sexologists. I mean, one is aereo-gender, you know, a flexible gender that changes every time I think of sex. And these are things that at least one person has mentioned in at least one article, as I understand. So I do think that comes out of the idea of here I am, as I sit before my computer, I can be anything, you know, in my personal opinion.
That's right. I mean, it's a really sad thing that's going on because, you know, I think there's good reason for the moral panic because you have this population, you know, in our generation, I was born in 1978, so I'm 42. In our generation, yeah, people were worried about teenage pregnancy with good reason, and people were worried about smoking with good reason or whatever. These were social activities and they were fun. And today, they developed you. I mean, I'm not advocating, you know, teenage sex or anything like that. It's not, but there's something so sad about teenagers sitting at home with their porn and knowing about choking, but who have never kissed another kid and never developed a relationship with another kid. They're deciding at age 11 that they're pansexual, but they've never so much held hands with another teen. Or tween. It's very sad, and it doesn't develop them the same way. And unfortunately, when they come out with that announcement, they're taken very seriously by their parents. They're celebrated online, and sometimes they're opening themselves to predators and encouragement from online adults who can't wait to tell a 12-year-old who's decided she's pansexual, a sheltered 12-year-old, that she's doing something heroic and agreeing with her. And sometimes, by the way, could you send me a photo?
This generational gap that we're talking about, Gen Xers and I don't call them Gen Z anymore. I call them digital natives because that's truly what they are. You know, they live in this space. And if you guys have seen the new social network movie on Netflix, there's a guy named Tristan Harris. He's like the social conscious of the Silicon Valley. I mean, there's a very clear correlation. I'm no quant guy, and you know, whatever, but if you have 10-year-olds in 2007 when social media really explodes and we have these outcomes, you know, it's really hard to disagree with the premise that this is in large part due to the influence of social media that's designed to chemically addict us to phones and all the likes and the shares and all those things. What are your thoughts on what Tristan and those guys are talking about in terms of the purposeful design to hook you to your phone and to social media and how it drives these kids?
So I think Tristan does really interesting work, very important work, and I think he's really onto something. I think he's exposed to a large degree the ways that these social media are manipulating us and luring us into a world. I think he has particular political issues that he's particularly concerned about with regard to that, you know, is his. I think that's something that drives him. But for me, I'm much more concerned about the culture that these kids are growing up with, the fact that they're afraid to say hello or nice to meet you or whatever to another teen, and that they're coddled by parents who go along with that and say, okay, that's your social anxiety. You don't have to say thank you. Just stay at home where you're comfortable. I'm worried that we're creating a generation of emotional invalids who are genuinely being pained by normal experiences that they really should have developed callous to long ago.
You know, I as a parent, I've experienced this where kids will say something like, "I'm socially awkward." I'm like, "Are you? You know, you're talking to me. You have great sense of humor. You're engaging. You're bright. I don't think you. I think you have social inexperience. You're a social rookie, but." You know, that's normal when you're 8, when you're 15, when you're 17, all of these things. Are we as parents, as Gen X parents, are we failing our kids by not shoving them out the door and said, here's a ball, there's outside, figure it out, and leave them to their own devices? I mean, I was a free range kid. I threw rocks, I lit fires, I was a straight hooligan. You don't want to follow my model. But
are we failing them? Yes, we are failing them. Now the question is why? Is it our fault? No, it's not totally our fault because the world's gotten less safe. I mean, look, I live in Los Angeles. We have the number of vagrants who are psychotic, who wander around is a lot. There are reasons to shelter and helicopter. There really are. It's not all irrational. But are we harming the kids? Absolutely. They are armed with a diagnosis, social anxiety. And we call up and too many Gen X parents will call up the teachers and say, please don't call on my child in class. It upsets them. We are catering to everything that used to be called shyness and used to be shoved out the door, as you said. And instead, we're putting bubble wrap around them, and it's making them so that they can't even engage with each other. These kids are not developing healthy sex lives. They're not developing healthy relationships. They're not developing healthy work relationships. They're just constantly victims, and they're constantly afraid. And yeah, we're not doing a very good job with them, unfortunately.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead, Will.
No, just very quickly. I mean, there seem to be a couple issues here. One of these is the extreme focus on shaming. So, I mean, you hear people talk about fat shaming, slut shaming, so on. And when you think about especially those two things in the context of a 15-year-old kid, those are not healthy behaviors. I mean, they're not healthy behaviors for adults either. But if you are a 15-year-old would-be athlete and you weigh 240 pounds, or you've been having promiscuous sex with, say, 10 or 15 people, that's probably something where, male or female, your dad should sit you down and start talking about what's going on. We've now moved in, at the least, we've now moved into the idea that it is bad to do that, one, and that two, behaviors like this tend to be caused by this range of medical conditions. So you guys have mentioned a couple of them. I mean, extreme social anxiety, the expansion of ADD into ADHD and the application of that to like one boy in 10. I have no doubt I would have been diagnosed as a smart but also aggressive kid. I would have been given some kind of speed that would have kept me in my room, writing poems about nothing all night. I mean, if you look at the side of a bottle of Adderall, by the way, it literally just says amphetamine. It's amphetamine salts. That's how you calm down overly aggressive males. You give them speed. But all of this stuff, I'm rambling a bit here, but I guess my question would be, how do you, while being sympathetic to the very small number of people that actually have, say, OCD, how do you control the diagnosis of this sort of thing? I mean, if you look at our major rivals like China, France, India, my focus tends to be as a mentor among males, but among men, the rate at which people are diagnosed with, say, ADD, extreme SAD is about 1/50th of ours. So how do we help the people that actually need help while controlling this idea that everyone is insane, bluntly?
So the reason I say that social media is behind a lot of this is actually your diagnosis becomes a huge part of your identity online. That's part of why we're rushing to diagnose. Once the kids have a diagnosis, they often take it online. They explain themselves to each other. The diagnosis becomes their identity. So it's really participating in all of this. Social media does. I mean, the shaming that you mentioned, the fat shaming, the reason that it's so scary, fat shaming, is not because obesity is a great thing for your health, but because having 1,000 people ridicule you in ways that are permanent online, that can always be visited, is beyond humiliating. It's really a level of pain and punishment that's way beyond a few people talking about you at school, or making comments at school. So the answer to your question is, I mean, it's complicated. It's going to be hard, but I will say that all this diagnosis is not doing kids very much good, and it's completely destroying their agency. They think that once they have a diagnosis, there's nothing they can do. And we need to stop diagnosing them so much. Really, we need to. It's a terrible habit, and it eliminates the fact that you can do a whole lot with very little. You can overcome all kinds of things, and you don't need, none of us is perfect. None of us would escape without a diagnosis today. And yet we've been able to overcome so many natural inclinations or failings.
When I was a kid, I was afraid of the ball. First year in Little League, and I would bail out of the box every single pitch. Can you imagine if that happened today? I would be a meme. I would be, a Vine or some kind of short video. How would I ever escape that? Like, the only people who remember are kids that played baseball with me, and I got over it literally the next season. I started hitting the ball fine, But I mean, it's just such a minor thing and so temporary. I mean, how long is a Little League season? 4 months, And then all of a sudden, I'm past it. I remember my last at bat. I'm like, next year, I'm not diving. I don't care if I get hit next year. Like, I got sick of it, and I grew because of it. And listen, that's just one experience. But we talk about this, and I should say, for everybody who's looking, Abigail, the link to Abigail's book is right here. If you're a parent, I mean, there's no answers in these things, but to have her illustrate this problem and give you some idea on, how you might approach it, because these moms and dads you're talking about, they love their kids. They're researching the answers. They know that, like, when their kid says, I love sports, and you're telling me in the book that tomboys have disappeared, we got a problem, And so your book, I think, is a fantastic resource to put some smarts into this literal craze. It's bonkers.
Thank you. I do think there's important things parents can do. And one of them is we've got to stop with this gender ideology in the schools. It's confusing children at a very young age. And when they hit adolescence and they're confused and they're uncomfortable in their bodies, they leap right to that as an explanation, as a club to join, even when they're not really gender dysphoric.
And if they are gender dysphoric, you're saying that typically it's a male to female transition, and it typically happens earlier as a norm. I mean, obviously there's exceptions, but.
That's right. It typically starts in early childhood. There have been biological females afflicted with it, extremely small numbers. And it's not the kind of thing that's a passing phase, and it's not the kind of thing you learn on the internet. And it's not the kind of thing you join the GSA for, the Gay Straight Alliance Club for, hoping for friends. It's a profound feeling. And one thing parents are doing that's unfortunate is we're taking young teens self-proclamations really seriously, and we're allowing them to post about them online. If a girl decides at 12 that she's pansexual, don't let her put that online. You know what? She's still deciding who she is. We're all works in progress, but especially our young teens. Let them be teens, and don't let them make any announcements that they can't easily walk back.
Yeah. I mean, just from that kind of male dad perspective, I mean, first of all, if your 12-year-old daughter announces she's bisexual, which is what that means, I mean, that may very well be true. But yeah, announcing that in a public internet forum is not a good idea. Definitely that sort of basic online etiquette, like don't talk about who you want to sleep with on Twitter and Facebook, is a good thing to teach your kids. One question that I have here, maybe the last one on my list, actually, but I noticed looking through your book and looking through the articles I've read about this, the large majority of the girls that are identifying as trans men or trans boys seem to be middle to upper middle class white or Hispanic girls. And I guess one question would be, is this a way to get sort of a unique or an oppressed identity? That's something I've actually written about a lot. The idea that you don't want to be just, an unsympathetic white lord. I mean, you've seen the Dolezal case, the Krug case. I will say that's very common in academia, in my opinion. But so you're not just a well-adjusted upper middle class woman from Cleveland. You might not decide you're trans, but you are, say, pansexual and moon gender. or you are a fat rights advocate, or any of these things. I mean, you mentioned people noting their mental health diagnoses. I see this very often with friends, teenage children. I have ADD, I have OCD. You may think I'm just normal, but I'm not. I struggle every day with my disease. This kind of thing. Do you think that that's valid, or is that a little too cynical? Like, is this a way to some extent to be different? You are, polyamorous, pansexual, and freaky, and moon gender is a description I've seen recently as a 20-year-old college student. Like, is that a way to make yourself stand out, or is there a mental health basis for that still in many cases?
No, of course, you're exactly right. It's loneliness. It's wanting to join. It's the same thing that afflicted us all at that age and afflicts troubled young women even most acutely. It is overwhelmingly white girls who are middle and upper middle class. And it's the one thing they can choose. They can't choose to be Black. They can't choose to come from an underprivileged background. They can't choose, but they can choose to be trans. They can choose to be
Black too.
They really can't though, right? I mean, they've done it, they've tried, and they've been humiliated for it. So the one thing they can choose is to be trans. And that gets a lot of respect. And, I talk to parents where the kid, progressive parents who celebrate, who thought it was good when their daughters joined the Gay Straight Alliance and were happy for them to be allies. And only to find, and these were progressive people, that the school year had become a nonstop pride parade in which everybody wore pins, and anyone who didn't wear a pin, including faculty who didn't wear a pin, were demonized. They do not want to be part of that group. They don't want to be the out group. They want to be the in group. And so they're rushing toward an identity that they hope will give them that.
Is there a trend for what these girls are experiencing? Like, is this a bunch of people with borderline personality disorder? And heaven forbid that's the case. Is it, young girls have so many problems with the anorexia and cutting and bulimia. Why are we adding another one to the list,
It's the same girls. It's just a new diagnosis. So it's the same borderline personality girls, same anorexic girls. It's the same population. They look to the culture to see what will get them sympathy for the pain that they're in. They're in real pain. And right now, one of the best things they can do to boost their status and to get them attention is by declaring a trans identity. The entire household that they're in stops. They get mom and dad's complete attention. They bring their parents to their knees. The parents will do anything to get them not to pursue hormones and surgeries. And right now they've got everybody's attention, and they get celebrated at school. It's a really, yeah.
And when that attention is pulled back in any way, they seek more of it, I'm assuming?
Well, at some point they have to prove they really are trans. That's the next step. So if you look like a girl, you're not going to get much street cred for very long. So then the question is, what drugs do you start? What procedures do you start? You don't need anything for a binder. Anybody can buy a binder at any age, even though it deforms breast tissue. It's the kind of thing that probably, should only be doctor approved. It deforms breast tissue, can lead to, rib cracking, shortness of breath. These are extremely strong compression garments that are not necessarily safe at all. So, they have to prove that they really are a member of the club.
If my daughter, and she's an adult now, about to graduate high school or college, if she had come to me as a 13-year-old and said, someone on the internet bought me a corset and I'm going to get into waist cinching, I would lose my damn mind. I almost swore. It would drive me crazy that someone has inserted themselves into my kid's life in a way that is, not a good thing for a young girl to do. I mean, first off, it's perverted to do that. And then via the internet, it's abusive. And God, how can that not be illegal? To buy a binder for somebody and to give it without a parent's consent, you can't take your kid roller skating, or you can't take someone else's kid roller skating without letting the parent know, hey, I'm going to put your kid on shoes with wheels. How in the world can you buy someone a binder?
Right, but because this gets confused with LGBTQ issues, parents who try to say no, who are progressive, have a hard time because they really don't want to be called transphobes, and they've been LGBTQ supporters their whole lives. So they do have a moment where they're really concerned about excommunication. As soon as their daughter's in harm's way, that tends to fall by the wayside. But in the beginning, they're extremely concerned about that. And then when they do object and say, honey, this isn't doing you any good, they have friends cut them off. They are called all kinds of things online. Sometimes their children post about them. They're afraid of losing their jobs. They're extremely isolated.
In the book, you talk about some of the steps to help with parents who have this situation kind of drop in their lap. And a lot of them seem to revolve around completely change your kid's environment, get them off the internet, move was one of them, like just move. What else have you learned? Is there anything else? I mean, you've written the book, it's not that old of a book, but has anything evolved in terms of what can we do as parents? This is not in the book, by the way, like the parent book. It's in your book.
I think we need to, number one, we have to limit their social media use. And I think eliminate it. I mean, kids, anybody under 18 should not be on social media. They shouldn't have their own, they shouldn't be posting about themselves. I got an interview the other, a couple months ago. Someone said, oh yeah, my kids are on the internet, but I just tell them, my 14-year-old or 13-year-old's on the internet, but I just tell them, don't post anything that you wouldn't want a future employer to see. Well, how is a 13-year-old supposed to do that? And I understand what they're saying. I mean, I do, but I can't pretend I would have any idea at 13 how to go about that, right? And that's what we're asking our kids who are on social media to do. We're asking them to behave like 30-year-olds. Well, they're not prepared to do that. And really, it's doing them a tremendous amount of harm. They're constantly aware of what they're being left out of or how imperfect they think they look. It's really cruel. We need to oppose to gender ideology in the schools. There's no reason you can't show compassion for a transgender child without sowing confusion in an entire student population. And we have to remember that parents are parents for the reason we do not have to go along with everything a child comes up about themselves. We don't have to agree. It's really, you're there for a reason, and it really is to put guardrails on a teenager's self-proclamations.
Will, anything in closing?
Yeah, I actually, one quick question there. One of the things I noticed reading through this book was that it was very apparent that at least to me, that a lot of these people that were identifying as trans or as various different genders today weren't trans in the classic sense. They didn't have gender dysphoria. I mean, that's such a rare specific condition that to me, I mean, you'd really need to talk to a psychologist, a clinician. I mean, you'd have to be diagnosed with it. So I guess that there are really two different questions I have here. You already answered part of the first one with Pete, but part one is, what would you do if your kid comes to you and starts saying some of these things and you don't think they are transgender? I mean, would you get rid of their binder? How would you react? And the second, I guess, more specific question is, what would you do if they were trans? If you had a kid that actually, this got serious enough that you took them to a psychologist and they were diagnosed with this condition, they believed that they were a member of the opposite biological sex. What would you do if you thought your daughter was experiencing this as a fad? And then what would you do if you thought this was all too real for your daughter or your son?
Okay, so I'll take the second one first. So first of all, remember that if a child presents with this, it's going to start in early childhood. This will not suddenly appear at age 13 in your daughter when she hits puberty. It's something you've noticed since the time she was a young girl. And remember that the vast majority of kids, if you did nothing, would outgrow it. So there is simply no reason not to let a child have the chance of outgrowing it. Many of these kids emerge as gay adults, some do not, but there's no reason that a parent needs to go in and do anything. Second of all, a psychologist is likely to agree because there are conversion therapy bans in so many of our states in which direct them that they could lose their license if they don't agree. So taking some psychologist's word for it, if you don't have reason to believe that they're really an honest a practitioner is really not the smart thing to do. I think there are good psychologists, but unfortunately there are a lot out there who are really just activists. And the question you asked before was, whoa, do you take away their binder if they come up with it? Well, how you react to a teenage girl who comes to you with this has to do with their age. If she's out of your house and in college, you're going to have a whole different set of conversations, and you have a lot less power and a lot less influence. 19-year-old doesn't really care what mom thinks, usually. She may care what mom does or does not pay for, but she doesn't care what mom thinks. But a 13-year-old is a very, very different matter. And sometimes when parents call me and their daughter's wearing a binder, I'll say to them, well, would you give her cigarettes? Why don't you give her cigarettes? Because A binder is going to deform breast tissue permanently. It could cause shortness of breath, rib cracking, and parents feel that they have to go along with this because of LGBTQ. Well, what in LGBTQ says you have to let your minor child permanently deform her body?
Nothing.
Right.
Nothing sensible, for 13-year-old girls.
Right. And look, I talk to a lot of lesbians who are horrified that we're going along with this, and a lot of young women, some of whom would just become lesbians if we left them alone.
This, just very quickly for me, like, this actually is one of the oddest things about this to me. Like, it's not what I lead with in my biography, but I would suppose I'm a feminist of the second wave since. I mean, obviously women should have the same chance to be business executives or sexually satisfied or happy in marriage as men. I think this is now universally agreed on. But one of the things that I heard constantly from feminist girlfriends in college is, there's no one way to be a woman. If I want to come to the gym and play ball with you guys one day, that's fine. That doesn't make me less feminine. If I want to go on to become a lawyer, that doesn't make me less feminine. I mean, it seems that there now almost is an element of conversion therapy to this in terms of the idea that if you are an aggressive, bisexual, feminist woman with some masculine characteristics, you're a man, and that you should present as that. And also, this stretches into the idea when you get into male to female transgender persons that lesbians should be very open to sex with people who are biologically male. I mean, so you see these weird, to me, cringe-inducing pieces in the gay press, like how to pleasure the female penis as a lesbian. And I mean, I can just imagine this coming from the right, like what you need is a big, you need guys in your life. And that would be viewed as, quite rightly, as disgusting, disturbing. But if people that are biologically male are presenting now as women, the idea is that you're a lesbian much like any other. At any rate, I guess the question is, what's the feminist take on that? I mean, I would assume you might well be a feminist in the same way I am. How does it, are people now accepting on a large scale that aggressive masculine women are men, or that those characteristics make you a man rather than a tomboy?
The thing to know here is that biological men are driving the activist agenda, and they are saying what we can, they are redefining women, and they're saying what we can and cannot talk about when it comes to young women's health. Wow. It's really an incredible power grab by them. And the way that they treat lesbians is really an untold story in our time. Lesbians are being constantly harassed. They are a sexual minority that is allowed to just be constantly harassed, so much so that, and I write about this in the book, that they have largely gone underground with their meetings. They need vetting processes in order to have social clubs, because they get constantly harassed by trans activists. The way women are being treated in society at large today is horrifying, frankly. And, this activist group of largely biological male is running the show, and they're determining who women are and how they are to be treated and what women are supposed to find acceptable. And it really is past time we stopped going along with this.
Agreed. Well, listen, we've had you for an hour. Thank you so much. Everybody should go out and buy Abigail's book. It's just a shocking read. I basically had to tape my mouth shut because my jaw just kept falling to the floor. I mean, the numbers, all of the interviews, it's all just, I mean, look, you do top quality work, but it's really such a fantastic read. So everybody should definitely go check it out. I got it on Audible. If you guys get those things, get it on Amazon through our link. That'll help the show out and help out Abigail. Thank you again so much. And anytime you write a book and want to come on the show, you're welcome to do it. It's just, thank you for doing this work. We all need it. I mean, our daughters especially need it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.